Hey everybody, good to see you again. And welcome to Topic 4, Lecture 1, one of my favorite chapters for the semester, and that is the chapter on civil liberties. So, what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, we're going to be defining some key terms. And the next two chapters that you're going to be reading, the chapter for this week, chapter 4, and the chapter for next week, chapter 5, we're going to define both of those terms in this lecture. And so we're going to define when we say the concept of civil liberties, we're going to define what that means. That's chapter 4. And then we're going to define what we mean by civil rights and how those are different. And that's chapter 5. Then we're going to take a look at the brief history of the Bill of Rights. As many of you know, the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, and they're amendments. And so when the Constitution was initially ratified, the ratification did not include the Bill of Rights. And so we're going to talk about why the Bill of Rights was not a part of the initial 7 articles of the Constitution and why they came about as amendments. And then we're going to be taking a look at this concept called nationalizing the Bill of Rights, okay? Asking the question of whether or not the Bill of Rights only applies to the actions of the federal government or whether it applies to the actions of the state as well. And so let's get started. All right, so let's start by defining some key terms. And we're going to start with defining civil liberties, which is chapter 4, the chapter you're going to be reading for this week. Your textbook defines civil liberties as individual rights and personal freedom with which governments are constrained from interfering. And so here's just some examples of these individual personal rights: that you have the freedom to speak, you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. And in the next lecture, we're going to obviously be going into more detail about what the freedom of speech is. What does it mean that you have the right to be free from unreasonable search? Okay. And as we know, we find these personal individual rights in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. Now, when I'm teaching about civil liberties, what I often tell students is that civil liberties in the Bill of Rights is basically telling government what they can't do, okay? And so I oftentimes tell students that the Bill of Rights is sort of the thou shall not. It's telling government what it shall not do. And so, for example, when you look at the First Amendment, the First Amendment starts and it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech, etc. And so the Bill of Rights is telling Congress that it can't do those things. Congress cannot abridge your freedom of speech, okay? And it's from this sort of mandate that we are placing on government, telling them what they can't do. It's in that space that we find our personal liberties and our individual rights. Okay, so that's what civil liberties are. All right, let's move on and talk about the second key term that we're going to be defining in this lecture, which is civil rights. And you're going to be learning about that in chapter 5, which is the chapter that we're going to be taking a look at next week. So your textbook defines civil rights as the obligations imposed on government to guarantee equal treatment and to protect citizens from discrimination. It's, when we talk about where civil rights come from, and you will learn this next week, they come from the so-called Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so when you think about civil rights, we're talking about equal protection of the citizens that live in the United States or in the states. And when we equal protection of the law is basically forcing the government to govern impartially, to not draw distinctions between individuals simply on differences that aren't really irrelevant to what the government is trying to achieve. Okay. And so, in other words, governments must, rule in an impartial manner. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title IX are two examples. You'll be learning about these next week. These are federal laws that are basically ensuring that the government is ensuring that people don't discriminate against other people. So, for example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin when it comes to things like employment, okay? And so that if you hire somebody or fire somebody or promote somebody, you can't do it in a discriminatory manner. So basically, you could say, well, I'm not going to hire any women, or I'm not going to hire any black folks, okay? Or I'm firing you because you're a woman, or I'm firing you because you are a Roman Catholic, right? And so, that's a good example of civil rights that we place. It's this obligation that we place on government to make sure that they treat people equally, and that since the government has that obligation to govern impartially, it needs to pass laws that make sure that people living in our country are not engaging in discriminatory behavior. Title IX is another good example. It's basically saying that no publicly funded educational institution can discriminate on the basis of sex, right? And so Title IX basically says that you can't not admit somebody to a college because they are a woman or because they are a man, okay? And so those are just some examples of civil rights, and we're going to be going into a lot more detail on that next week. So sometimes civil liberties and civil rights can come into conflict with each other. They can kind of clash. In other words, there's times when a person might be exercising their personal liberty that in their exercise of their personal freedom, they might be discriminating against somebody, and that the government has its obligation to prevent that type of discrimination, okay? So there are times when you exercising your individual beliefs and you're putting your beliefs into action, maybe your religious beliefs, maybe your political beliefs, you might be doing it in a way that results in, treating people unfairly in a way that is contrary to either state law or federal law. So our discussion this week revolves around this clash between civil liberties and civil rights. And so you'll get an opportunity to talk about that. And on the next slide, we're going to take a look at two examples of where we have this clash or this conflict between civil liberties and civil rights. But before we look at the next slide, maybe pause the video and ask yourself, can you think of any examples of the conflict between an exercising of a person's personal liberties and the way that might be resulting in discrimination in a way that the government might need to step in and say, hey, you can't exercise your personal liberties in that way because we have an obligation to prevent discrimination. So take a moment to sort of think about that, and then I'll talk to you on the next slide. Okay, so here are two examples of the conflict between civil liberties and civil rights. And the first example we're going to talk about is actually the topic that you will be doing your this week's discussion on. And so that's a picture of Jack Phillips. He owns a cake shop in Colorado. It's called Masterpiece Cake Shop. And he is a devout Christian, and the way that he interprets Christianity, that his interpretation of Christianity is that marriage can only be between a man and a woman, that if you're a Christian, you cannot support same-sex marriage. And so one day, a same-sex couple came into his cake shop, and they wanted him to make a wedding cake for their ceremony. And Jack Phillips said, you know what, I can make you a birthday cake and any other kind of cake, but because of my religious beliefs, I cannot make you a wedding cake for your ceremony. And so the gentleman left his shop, and then they filed a suit against Jack Phillips because he violated Colorado's anti-discrimination law. So Colorado had laws in its book saying if you owned a public accommodation, like a bake shop, that you could not discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. So you'll go into this in a lot more detail in your discussion, but it's a good example of Jack Phillips exercising his religious beliefs, but that in exercising his religious beliefs, they conflict with Colorado state law that is designed to prohibit discriminatory behavior. Here is another example that I think a lot of you are familiar with. That's a very famous photo. And that is a photo from the Unite the Right rally that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. This was a rally of neo-Nazis and white supremacists that they were opposing the removal of Confederate monuments, and that they wanted to come together to raise support for white supremacy. And they gathered and they chanted racist and anti-Semitic slurs at people who had come to protest against the Unite the Right rally. So, here is a conflict between somebody expressing their viewpoint through their speech, through a rally, but what they are saying is discriminatory, right? And so there's a question about when a group is promoting hate speech that could, create an environment that would result in hateful or discriminatory action by the group or by others. And so it's this conflict again between people expressing themselves, but the state having an obligation to make sure that that speech doesn't potentially lead to discrimination. So just another example of that conflict. And we'll be talking about that, the hate speech and whether or not that receives First Amendment protections in the next lecture. All right, so let's turn our sights to take a look at a brief history of the Bill of Rights. So, as we know, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. But we also know that the Constitutional Convention concluded without a Bill of Rights, and that when the Constitution was ratified, it was ratified without the Bill of Rights. And so the question is why didn't the original Constitution include a Bill of Rights? Why did these have to come as amendments after the Constitution was ratified by the states? And, in your textbook, you talked about the difference between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, okay? And the Federalists are those people. And in fact, you have a CIA, a Citizenship and Action paper that you can write, which is basically, can make an argument in favor or against the Federalist or the Anti-Federalist perspective. Those who supported the Constitution and created the Constitution, they're known as the Federalists, okay? And so James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, the writers of the Federalist Papers, they're all Federalists. The Anti-Federalists are the ones who were a little bit, they didn't want to ratify the Constitution. They were basically skeptical of the Constitution because they felt like the Constitution gave the federal government way too much power and didn't provide enough protection for the power of states, and also didn't provide enough protection for the individual freedoms of the people, of the citizens. And so, as you read in your textbook, as a part of the ratification process, there was an argument from the states, and I think I've mentioned this in previous lectures, that states didn't want to ratify the Constitution because it didn't provide these protections for the state power and for the individual freedoms of the people that lived in the United States. So why didn't the Federalists want a Bill of Rights? Why were they initially against including a Bill of Rights in the Constitution? And that quote from Alexander Hamilton kind of, encapsulates the reasons why a Bill of Rights wasn't included. He said, Hamilton wrote, "For why declare that things shall not be done which there is no power to do?" Okay? And so keep in mind that the Bill of Rights is a thou shall not. It's telling Congress that it can't abridge your speech. It's telling Congress that it can't take away your right to bear arms. It's telling Congress that it can't search you in an unreasonable way. And what Hamilton and the other Federalists said is we don't need to tell Congress what it can't do when we haven't given Congress the power to abridge your speech, when we haven't given Congress the power to establish a church, right, or a religion, okay? So Hamilton's saying we don't need a Bill of Rights because there's enumerated powers in the Constitution, and if Congress can't do it, then they would be in violation of the Constitution. Well, that was a good argument, but it didn't settle the concerns that the Anti-Federalists had. So, as we know, as a compromise to get the ratifications of the states who were worried that this gave way too much power to the federal government, that James Madison and the other Federalists agreed that, you know what, you guys ratify the 7 articles, and our first act will be to create a Bill of Rights, satisfying the concerns that you have about diminished or lack of protection for individual rights. And so James Madison, as a member of the first Congress, he wrote the Bill of Rights, and that, so he presented amendments to Congress, and then Congress passed some of those amendments, and then finally 12 of the passed amendments that were given to Congress, 10 of those were ratified by the states. So it was written by James Madison in 1789, and he reported that he felt like getting the task of writing the Bill of Rights. He reports that he viewed that as a nauseous project, like a project that made him sick to his effing stomach, right? And the reason is because he was really worried that if you're asked to write down what Congress can't do, that there would be an implication that if it was not actually enumerated, Congress can't do this, government can't do this, right? That then it could open the door to say, well, I guess if you said that you didn't say Congress couldn't do it, so that must mean that Congress can do it. So he's really worried that not all liberties would be included. What are the right liberties to include? And also, did it open the doorway for Congress to do things that it actually didn't have the power to do? Kind of what Alexander Hamilton was saying. That being said, that 10 amendments were ratified by the states in December 15th, 1791. And that's a special date for me because December 15th is my birthday. And that's right. I was born in 1791 because I am a vampire. See, there it is, a picture of me without my professor garb on. Just joking, really not a vampire. Or am I? Oh! So, how many rights do you know from the 10 amendments that make up the Bill of Rights? So, how many rights in the Bill of Rights do you know? Do you know what's in the First Amendment? We talked about that earlier in the semester. What's the Second Amendment? The Fourth Amendment? The Eighth Amendment? You might want to just take a second right now and just test yourself because it's fun, and just get out a pencil and then just, sort of write down, that there's 10 amendments. See, hey, what's in the First Amendment? What's in the Second, the Third, the Fourth, the Fifth, and just see how many you can enumerate. All right, talk to you again soon. In a second, the lecture's not over. All right, so here's a table for your graph that I think is helpful because it takes the 10 amendments from the Bill of Rights and it kind of puts them in different categories. So the First Amendment gets its own category. It says that, because there are so many liberties that are enumerated in the first. And so that the First Amendment says that Congress can't make laws establishing religion, abridging the freedom of religion, speech, assembly, or petition. Then you have the Second, Third, and Fourth Amendment. The Second Amendment has to do with the right to bear arms. The Fourth Amendment has to do with unreasonable search and seizure. And the Third Amendment is basically saying that the government can't put soldiers in your house. They can't quarter the militia in your house. And so in a way, the Fourth and the Third are about your domicile, your private places, right? Sort of like, hey, government can't come and put soldiers in your house. Government can't search you without probable cause. And that self-protection that comes from the right to bear arms. The next group, the amendments 5th through 8th, those all have to do with the rights of the criminally accused. And so that once you've been accused of a crime, a whole bunch of rights get triggered. So you have a right to a jury trial, you have a right to a speedy trial, you have a right to remain silent, you can't be forced to testify against yourself, and if you are found guilty, you can't be punished in a cruel or unusual manner. And then Amendments 10 and Amendments 9 are right at the end of the Bill of Rights. Now we know about the 10th Amendment because we learned about that in federalism. And the 10th Amendment basically says that any right that's not given to the national government, so any right non-enumerated, those rights are reserved to the states and to the people, okay? So it's the Reserved Powers Amendment. The Ninth Amendment is an amendment that addresses James Madison's concern about being nauseous about leaving out certain rights. The Ninth Amendment says that the enumeration of certain rights in the Constitution should not be interpreted to mean that those are the only rights the people have. And that's a paraphrasing of the Ninth Amendment. So basically, it's saying that just because we didn't write it down, the right in the Bill of Rights, doesn't mean that people don't have those rights. I kind of really like the Ninth Amendment because it makes your civil right, your civil liberties, your personal freedoms a little bit more expansive because of the Ninth Amendment. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is nationalizing the Bill of Rights. Okay, and let me tell you an anecdote to get you started on that. Okay, so when I was a youngin, in my late teens, early 20s, I was like a pretty hardcore civil libertarian, right? I was like, I could say whatever I could want, I could write whatever I want, I could listen to any music I want. I don't mess with my rights. And I'm still a pretty hardcore civil libertarian, but I understand, as we're going to be talking about on the next lecture, that there's a balance between your individual rights and also the responsibility that the government has to make sure that the way you exercise your rights doesn't infringe upon the rights of others, okay? But anyways, I had this thing, it was called a VCR. Do you guys remember what those are? They're like old-timey DVD players. And that we had videotapes that we would stick into our VCRs to watch. And I put on my VCR player, I had a sticker of the First Amendment. That's what it's there, right? And I put it on there because I was like, hey, Congress is going to make no law abridging speech, right? So if I want to watch like a violent show or a sexy movie or whatever, it was like, those are my rights, okay? But then one day, as I was putting a tape into the VCR, I was actually looking at, and this was before I started studying political science, I was actually looking at the First Amendment, and I was reading it, and it says, Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, etc. And I was like, Congress? Now, wait a second. Congress is the federal lawmaking branch. Does that mean that the states can make laws abridging my freedom of speech? And at the time I lived in Indiana, which is kind of a conservative state, I was like, oh, I better check out Indiana laws. Like maybe they can abridge my speech or, criminalize what we read or what we listen to. No, they can't. But I was stuck on that word Congress, and I kept thinking, does the First Amendment just apply to Congress, or does it apply to all levels of government? And that's what nationalizing the Bill of Rights is about. It's the question about whether or not the Bill of Rights only applies to the actions of the national government, or does it apply to the actions of all governments? So let's look at the answer to that question. So does the Bill of Rights apply only to the actions of the federal government, or does it also apply to the actions of state and local governments as well? Well, until 1868, the answer to that question was that that the Bill of Rights only applied to federal action. And that question was asked in this really cool case called Barron versus Baltimore. And it dealt with a provision in the Fifth Amendment called the Takings Clause. So let me tell you a little bit about this case. So Baltimore has like a body of water right by the city. And back in the day, in the early to mid part of the 1800s, even before that, that a lot of people made their livelihood off of the ships that would come into the harbor. And then they would own a wharf, and then they would help unload the ships, and they would make money that way. And that's what John Barron's business was. John Barron was a wharf owner. He owned a portion of land along the body of water, and that it was actually a really great wharf because where his dock was, the water was really deep. And so big boats, all boats would sort of feel comfortable and confident coming to his wharf because they knew that their ship would be, they knew it wouldn't be damaged. Well, the city of Baltimore, which is in the state of Maryland, decided that they wanted to improve the streets in Baltimore and basically make their infrastructure better. And so what Baltimore did is that in the process of improving its streets, it like dug up ground, gravel, silt, and it threw it into the harbor. Okay. And unfortunately, they threw a lot of the silt near John Barron's wharf. And so John Barron went from having this great business to having a really crappy business because the city of Baltimore was putting all this gravel and stuff in the bay, and he was no longer he lost his livelihood. Ships could not come and dock there anymore. And so John Barron looked at the Fifth Amendment and he said, you know what, in the Fifth Amendment, it says that it has the takings clause. And what the takings clause basically said is that government can take your property, but it must give you the market value of that property. And so if government does something that takes away your property, they can do that, but they've got to pay you for it, right? They've got to give you the value of the property. And so John Barron looked at that and they said, you know what? The city of Baltimore, it violated my Fifth Amendment rights. They took my property from me because they ruined it. They made it so that it wasn't usable, but they never paid me for it. So the question came to the Supreme Court of the United States in 1833, asking the question about whether or not the takings clause in the Fifth Amendment applied to the actions of cities and states. And the answer that the Supreme Court said was that the Fifth Amendment does not apply to the states, that the Bill of Rights is a prohibition on the actions of the federal government, not on state governments. And so if the state of Maryland had a provision in its state constitution that said that you couldn't take away property without giving value for that property to the owner, then that amendment would apply to John Baltimore. But the Fifth Amendment from the United States Bill of Rights does not apply to John Baltimore. So the answer to the question, does the Bill of Rights apply to the federal government? Up until 1868, it didn't apply to the actions of the state and local government. So why did it change? Well, it changed following the Civil War. And after the Civil War, 3 amendments were added to the Constitution, one of which is the 14th Amendment. And in the 14th Amendment, and so the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendment were all designed to make sure that states didn't take away rights from previous slaves, okay? People who used to be slaves, okay? And one of the provisions in the 14th Amendment is called the Due Process Clause. And the Due Process Clause tells states that it can't take away its people's life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, okay? We won't go into a lot of detail. You can read more about that in the textbook. And if you'd love to talk about the Due Process Clause and its relationship to the Bill of Rights, I'd be more than happy to talk about it with you in office hours. But the bottom line is that after the Due Process Clause was added in 1868 in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, people looked at the Due Process Clause and said, you know what? States can't take away your liberty. And so that basically means that the liberties that are in the Bill of Rights, that those apply to the states and local government as well. And that's the way it worked out. That the Due Process Clause was seen as an avenue to incorporate the Bill of Rights to state and local actions. And it's called selective incorporation. That in 1868, with the inclusion of the 14th Amendment, then suddenly people would look at the actions of states that were taking away your liberty, and they would go liberty by liberty and bring the question to the court. And they would say, can states abridge your freedom of speech? And the court would say yes or no. Can states search you without probable cause? They would answer yes or no. So they actually went liberty by liberty until most of the liberties in the Bill of Rights were incorporated to the states. And that's what's known as selective incorporation. Okay, and this is a table that shows you what I mean by selective incorporation. And so let me put on my magic pen here, okay? And you can basically see that starting in the late 1800s, 1897, the question came to the Supreme Court about the different liberties, about whether or not they applied to the state actions. And in the famous case Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad versus Chicago, the railroad case, that question about eminent domain, about whether Chicago takes property from railroads, does the Chicago have to pay the railroads the value of the property that they take from it? The eminent domain taking clause. And in that, the Supreme Court said yes, via the Due Process Clause, you can't take away people's property without the due process of law. and therefore it incorporated the that takings clause, eminent domain, to the states. And then it goes basically liberty by liberty, not amendment by amendment, but liberty by liberty. Next was the question about whether speech, that states can't abridge your speech. Yes, no, they cannot. Press, religion, etc. Okay? And you'll note all the way down here on the bottom is one of the most recent liberties to be incorporated or applied to the states. And that's the Second Amendment's right to bear arms. It wasn't until 2010 that the question came to the court about whether or not Chicago, a city, tries to take away or infringe upon your right to bear arms. Chicago had a law in the book saying nobody could own a handgun in Chicago. Whether or not that violated your constitutional right to bear arms. And in this case, McDonald v. Chicago, the Supreme Court incorporated or applied the right to bear arms to the states. So look, it took many, many years and many, many people fighting from their cities and their states, basically saying that their cities or states were engaging in unconstitutional behavior that was prohibited by the Bill of Rights. It took all of that time for the courts to say, yep, states and local governments can't infringe upon your rights either. So let's end the lecture by thinking critically about this idea of selective incorporation or selective application of the liberties to the states. So should all the provisions of the Bill of Rights be applied to the states at once? In other words, once the Due Process Clause from the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution, should the Supreme Court just said, you know what, all of the Bill of Rights apply to the states? That's what's known as total incorporation. That's not what the Supreme Court did. They decided to go liberty by liberty, and in fact, not all of the liberties in the Bill of Rights have actually been incorporated to the state. There are still some liberties that have not been applied to the states. For example, the grand jury. In the Fifth Amendment, it says that you have to have a grand jury. Well, states don't have to give you a grand jury. It's a good example of a liberty that hasn't been applied to the states. So should the Supreme Court have totally incorporated the Bill of Rights? And what would that have looked like if starting in 1900 or whatever, 1901, every liberty was incorporated to the states? What are the advantages of going liberty by liberty? Are there advantages to doing it that way? And what if the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal actions? So let's say that the Supreme Court said that the Due Process Clause is not an avenue to incorporate the Bill of Rights to the states, so that you would basically have two sets of rights. There would be the Bill of Rights that applies only to the national government, and then your state Bill of Rights that would apply to the actions of state governments. What if the Bill of Rights only applied to federal actions and not states, effectively setting up two charters of liberties, your federal charter and your state charters? What impact would that have on democracy? Do you think it would diminish your rights? Or do you think people might have gotten more actively involved in creating a robust Bill of Rights for their states? And perhaps more liberties might have been protected? Just something to think about, and questions like these will come up on the midterm exam. Thanks for paying attention. I appreciate your time, and I'll talk to you again soon.